Hi, I'm Jim Lindemann again. This is our third session together. The first session talked about science and unfortunately the way that science can be manipulated by a person's outlook or philosophy, but that's the way it is. The second, we talked about evolution and its effect on culture and the contrast that of a God who cares, a God who participates, a God who sets foot on this world. This third session now we're going to talk about is life. What is life? What is it about? Now we start off with Andy Capp, and he says, well, let's see now what to say. And she says, I'm waiting for an explanation and I want the truth. And he says, there she goes again, confusing me. Problem so often with evolution is that they want to give an explanation, but where in the explanation is the truth? So let's take a look at what life means and what it is about. First of all, you have this statement by Jules Pfeiffer in The Cell, which is part of the Life Science Library of Time Incorporated back in 1964. In this quiet, odorous scene, major chemical transformations are underway at the molecular level. Proteins and other long-chain molecules are being formed, the first primitive enzymes. Crude substances by compounds which nevertheless accelerate chemical reactions, take shape and speed other reactions. As compounds react with one another, forming larger and more complex molecules of organic matter, they tend to form self-feeding cycles, each step in the cycle being accelerated by a primitive enzyme. Such cycles introduce a repetitive pattern into the hitherto random processes taking place in the lake. Where the environment once influenced the synthesis of organic compounds, the organic compounds are now beginning to influence to organize the environment. The sedimentary slime has become more aggressive chemically. The actors are taking over the stage management. Life is coming closer with each millennium. Somewhere along the line, blobs of jelly-like material appear, systems of active regenerating cycles enclosed in membranes, the remote ancestors of life. Now when you take a look at this, this is time life. This is something that is really, really up there in terms of what's supposed to be expertise. You have imagination is wonderful. It's fascinating. The only thing is that we've never seen anything like this. And we really wouldn't know how it happens. And there's a lot of other problems that we will talk about in terms of having the first cell or even the different elements of what is necessary for that cell. Imagination can be useful, yet it does not equal reality. A good story does not make truth. Fantasy can even obscure fact. It's romantic, but not a word of it is really scientific. It's on the same level as Star Wars. It's on the same level as Lord of the Rings. It sounds great. It's wonderful fantasy. But of course, what is the reality out of which it's supposed to reflect? An impossible scenario. Oops. Okay. False assumptions in description. We believe that evolution somehow magically creates greater overall value and order on Earth. Evolution means the creation of larger and larger islands of order at the expense of ever greater seas of disorder in the world. In other words, that it is ordering. But how does something that's random, how does something that has absolutely no intent or purpose or direction create order out of chaos? The false assumptions in the description. Is random evolution purpose-driven? The big question is, why would it be? I mean, there's nothing that's driving it. There's nothing that's making it want to be. And yet you listen to so many, or you read so many of the evolutionists' concepts, and you have this sense that it is somehow being pushed toward something greater. Random doesn't work that way. Random can go either way, and it doesn't matter. And it doesn't have any agenda or target. It has no destiny to fulfill. Do we really see molecules actively attempting to form long chains on their own? You know, this is wonderful, but how? Where would you do that? Where would you see that? You must assume a godlike will is operating, that's driving it, making it go to the next step. Why should it want to? It's satisfied with where it is right now. The problem with the idea of evolution and the idea of natural selection and all the other kinds of things assumes that everything wants to go up the ladder, whatever that ladder is. But you haven't given me any reason why it should. Evolution is purposeless. There's no intelligence at work. Then why is it driving itself to more islands of order? Random. Anything is anything in any possible way. And yet it's always supposed to be upward, never downward. It's always irreversible, never only one direction. It's never going a different direction. Always smaller to bigger, which is Cope's law. It's a law. Always less to more complex. Always less to more perfect. And it's not repeatable. Well, that's wonderful to be able to say these are the things that are happening, but we have no evidence. And really, we have no reason for these kinds of conclusions based upon these assumptions. As a matter of fact, when you get into thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, as things tend toward chaos on their own, that, okay, well, you can say, well, in an open system because the sun is shining and everything else like this. But the thing is that ultimately, when everything has been said and done, it is not an open system. And it's not where you're going to have something progressing. Ultimately, it is destined for absolute destruction. Random is mindless. Same unusable combination of compounds may be retried endlessly. So you have these things and you're just kind of constantly trying over and over and over and over and over again. You know, when you take a look at the law of probability, the assumption is that if this doesn't work, it throws away that possibility and goes on to the next one. But random doesn't work that way. It doesn't have the ability to try and then put aside, try and put aside until finally it hits the right combination. And so there's all kinds of assumptions here which have absolutely no basis in fact or reality. Simply because we try each other because that's what's at hand. Who's going to mix the pot? Who's going to say, well, okay, these don't work, so here, let me take these over here, and these over here, and these over here. There isn't any, unless you postulate some kind of a godlike influence. No thought process to put aside failures and try different sequences. No natural selection. What filter eliminates lesser candidates? What filter eliminates less viable possibilities? Yet amino acids are only left-handed, nucleotides, sugars, only right-handed. We'll get into this a little bit further, but the question there is that if it is totally random, What selected out the opposite hand of the amino acids? That there are no right-handed amino acids. There aren't any. Or the other way around. In the cell, the amino acids are right-handed. In the nucleus, the nucleotides are only right-handed. Sugars are only right-handed. So what in this, all this randomness, all of this purposelessness, all of this would select out the opposite side when it has no reason to. It has no purpose to, no point to it. Miller's creation of organic compounds. This is a deceptive word because organic sounds like it is something that has been manufactured by something alive, or it is aiming toward being alive. And that's not what organic means. Yeah, you have the related to or derived from living organisms. But in chemistry, an organic compound does not mean the compound has been made by a life form, or necessarily is connected to a life form in any way. It merely refers to a class of molecules that have a certain element, basically carbon, in them. And so you can have this organic being thrown around, and many people get misled because they think this is something that is dealing with life. And it has nothing, necessarily, that even touches life. Pfeiffer again, at the cell. Laboratory studies indicate the possible nature of the early steps in this process. In 1952, an American graduate student in chemistry named Stanley L. Miller assembled a simple apparatus which stood about 2 feet high and included glass tubing and a globular flask. Miller circulated through this apparatus a sample of hypothetical early atmosphere, a mixture of water vapor, hydrogen, ammonia, and methane. He arranged his equipment so that the mixture of water vapor and gases drifted continuously through the crackling spark. After circulating past the spark, liquid condensed in the vapor drop by drop in the flask and gradually collected at the bottom. Miller then let the mixture circulate for about a week. The synthesis by electricity had produced an impressive list of carbon-containing organisms. All right? Organism. An individual form of life such as a plant, animal, bacterium, protist, or fungus. A body made up of organs, organelles, and other parts that work together to carry on the various processes of life. A system regarding it as analogous to, in its structure or functions to a living body, a social organism. You have a word here that indicates something that's alive, something that is a total entity. That is not what he had. And what I maintain here is that you have what's called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is using emotionally charged words to convey a subtle message in addition to what the words actually mean. So in other words, you call somebody a Neanderthal. What you're doing is you're conveying a whole concept of a stupid, half-primate, caveman, whatever else like that. And so you can say Neanderthal, but at the same time, you can also mean a whole bunch of other things. You have homophobic. What's the word mean? It means I'm afraid of man. Or I'm afraid of one's own sexuality. Now the thing is that, in other words, if I am against, say for instance, gay marriage or gay kinds of things, then I will be tagged by this. And the thing is that no, I'm not. I'm not afraid of them. I have honestly looked at this, considered this, and feel that, no. it violates not only what God says, but it also violates what God intended the sexes to be about. Because they are to be about how He expresses Himself in this creation. And that's why He doesn't want it to be messed with. And that's why Satan's so intent on making this happen in our culture. I'm not homophobic. I'm not afraid of him. I just happen to feel very strongly that this is not what God wants. Scientist. Again, it's a colored word. Scientists tell us, science tells us, and that throws a whole bunch of an emotional impact to a pronouncement that, as we just saw in the last slide, is basically just imagination. It's fantasy. But because a scientist says it, it now has the ring of truth. The same thing with organism. Organism suggests very strongly that there's a living entity at the tail end of this experiment, and that cannot be even further from the truth, from what was there. And so we have this kind of game being played, even in something that is so sophisticated and supposed to be so expert as a time-life library. Amino acids and nucleotides are not organisms. Hypothetical early atmosphere was it based on evidence, or what was necessary for the experiment to work? In other words, it is the fallacy, the logical fallacy of assuming what you are going to prove. I'm going to assume this kind of an atmosphere, and lo and behold, it gives me the results that I want. And look, see, that's the way it happened. No. As a matter of fact, even though he had done this way back in the 1950s, never has that experiment or anyone like it been tried again. So for over 60 years, nobody has tried to create an experiment which would create the early evidence of life. Why? Because all of this has to occur in an atmosphere in which there is no oxygen, because oxygen will destroy these products. And what do we find in the stones? We find rust. We find oxidation. In other words, there was enough oxygen that was circulating in this supposedly primeval soup, at the time of the primeval soup, that would have destroyed right away anything that had been created. And so you have this sense of you're creating a circular reasoning. You're going to assume something, make it work, but you cannot demonstrate that that's actually the way it was. And it even starts with an organic compound. Methane is carbon, hydrogen, 4 atoms of hydrogen. And so here you have, he's starting with something that's organic. Well, look at this. The end product is going to be organic. Doesn't mean anything about the whole process which he did that suggests there was any kind of living that was being expressed or being part of that kind of experiment. Must be without oxygen, but stone strata shows oxidation, constant lightning bolt, realistic. You kind of wonder about this. Well, where did this constant little snapping spark, crackling spark come from? If you're talking about lightning, take a look at what lightning does. You have yet to have anything come to life because of lightning. My dad had once brought home a little rectangular box, and in the box there was 4 sets of cones. And what you did was you put a hot dog on one side And then on one cone, and you put a hot dog, the hot dog other end on the opposite cone. And you filled up the 4 that way, and then you closed, after you plugged it in, you closed the lid. Now you have raw energy going into what at least should have all the material for living, because it came from something that was living, a hot dog, supposedly. What happened when you closed that lid? The hot dogs cooked. They did not come alive. That's the problem with using lightning as your source of creating life, is that lightning is so much raw energy that all it does is it destroys. It destroys trees, it destroys buildings, it destroys all kinds of things. It destroys life. Trapped to preserve, else the same conditions destroyed. He had to make it so that whatever was created would be then saved out, because otherwise the same things that would create these different compounds would just as easily destroy them. And that's the randomness again. You see, that's where you have the problem, is that if it's going to be random, then you have to identify the fact that it will do exactly the opposite from what you would like it to be. That ends to the evolutionary road to life. So as we talked about before, there's only left-handed amino acids. If you have protein with right-handed amino acids in them, they are destroyed. They just fall apart. What does the right-handed, left-handed mean? It's called chirility. It rotates light, polarized light, as a screw, to the left or to the right. And so only left-handed amino acids, they rotate the light, polarized light toward the left. The nucleotide, now you think about this. There's a thin membrane that separates the nucleus from the rest of the cell. In the rest of the cell, everything, all the amino acids are right-handed. Inside the cell, they're only left-handed. Excuse me. Left-handed amino acids, there's only right-handed inside the cell. And a very thin membrane between the two. And there's no mix. No right and left mixes. Sugars are only right-handed. Now, how does evolution, who is supposed to be run by absolute chance, make that kind of a thing happen? Conditions to create also destroy. Miller's 53 creation of amino acids. No other attempt for 60 years. Nobody is brave enough to try and postulate even what that early atmosphere should have been. Because the thing is that you're always going to have oxygen. And the oxygen destroys. Proteins on their own naturally break down. Oxygen destroys. Other created compounds also destroy. You think about this, average protein has 288 of the 12 amino acid types. In other words, just to get a protein together, you're not even talking about like a DNA strand or anything else like this. You're just talking about a simple little protein strand. It has to have 288 correct connections for it to exist, out of 12 possibilities. 400 proteins in the simplest of life. The simplest life. You think about the enormous requirements of time to allow those so many choices, or so many connections and failures and connections and you have the mathematics in which it is something like 400 zeros. 1 in 400 zeros 1 followed by 400 zeros. You're talking about something that is so enormously unlikely that it now becomes impossible. Require a massive amount of proteins, amino acids, too diluted in the sea. What do you think of this? If there are going to be so many attempts and so many tries and everything else like, you have to have a soup that has to be fairly thick. And you think in terms of the size of the oceans, if this is where it started, how the oceans must have been so thick. And is that a realistic identification? In other words, you have to have oceans that are just literally packed with amino acids, or some way by which something that is so vast as the ocean would still only restrict the amino acids to only a small area, so that the attempts to try to connect and come up with a string would actually happen. When engines would provide a constant supply. In other words, how would you get those kinds of, especially if you're looking at the fact is that they're going to be breaking down on their own, you're going to have a constant supply, constantly doing this. Where is that going to be? How does that work? Occasional lightning bolt cannot do it. You know, you think of Frankenstein's problem of lightning. You know, oh, get the lightning and then now Frankenstein's monster becomes alive. Well, you think about what happens with a defibrillator. You know, it used to be where you have on TV, oh, the guy's heart stopped. Here, let's get the defibrillator on him, and woof, and all of a sudden, the heart starts again. And those who know medicine laugh, because a defibrillator does not start a heart, it stops a heart. What's happening with fibrillation is that the heart is going, everything's firing at once, and there is no beat going through the heart in order to pump the blood properly. Everything is just going like that. And so the idea of the defibrillator is to stop the heart with the hope that it will restart back into its pattern. Raw energy doesn't create life. We have no evidence of that. Raw energy's evidence is that it stops life. You have the same problems if life came to Earth from elsewhere. Sometimes you have, well, Earth was seeded by life from somewhere else. Well, that's wonderful to hear you say that, but all you've done is beg the question. How did life start there in order to be able to seed life here? And it would have to start life early enough so that it can make the trip from there to here. And you think of the closest star, how many light years would it have to travel just if it was the closest star to be able to see life here? And again, you've got such enormous impossibilities. It's great to say imagination, it's great to say fantasy, but you have nothing to show you how that could happen. Natural reactions, nucleotides are chemical bases, amino acids are chemical acids. What happens when a base, say for instance baking soda, and an acid, vinegar, combine? Well, when you were a kid, if you ever made a volcano, that's what you did, was you put that in there and you end up with it fizzing and being a chemical reaction that ends up stopping. Because once the acid and the acid and the alkali combine and they're done, the reaction's done. So we have in the cell the perfect breeding ground for this kind of a reaction because you have bases, alkalis, and you have acids. And you know what? It doesn't happen. Why? Why doesn't it happen? But in living cells, DNA is used to code for the production of proteins in a special way, so that no chemist would ever have reason to suspect. There is no natural chemical tendency whatsoever for a series of triplet base groups to line up with a series of amino acid R groups. Then they could roll a 13 on a pair of dice. Yet somewhat paradoxically, once living systems have been created and the vital DNA-protein relationship established, living things continue to multiply after their kinds in understandable and predictable ways that certainly violate no laws of chemistry. Given meaningful DNA, given a controlled supply of energy and raw materials, given a coordinated, not random set of translating molecules, including messenger and transfer RNA, ribosomes, and very special amino acid activating enzymes, living cells use DNA continuously to make proteins. What could not have been done in the test tube is always being done in the cells of your bodies. The first primitive enzymes, this is Pfeiffer in the cell, crude substances but compounds which nevertheless accelerate chemical reactions, take shape and speed other reactions. All right, let's just take a look at this for a moment. Such enzymes would be too dangerous. Enzymes, like catalysts, speed up forward and reverse reactions equally and accelerate only the drive toward equilibrium. In other words, so that there is no more reaction. An enzyme that would link two amino acids to form a peptide bond would just as readily break one already formed. With the immense number of peptide bonds present in the protein of an organism, simple mass action arguments will show that such an enzyme would spend most of its working life breaking the bonds and would work havoc on its host. You see, this is one thing. You have Pfeiffer with the cell. He's got this wonderful, beautiful scenario imagined. But if you take a look closely at what he's saying, it becomes ridiculous. Because the assumption is that everything is going to go together to go in a certain direction. And once you have entered the idea of random, then you have also destroyed the possibility of that happening. You think of like a tree being planted. It's being dug up from over here, and it's brought over here, and it's being planted in a hole over there. What has happened? No physical laws are broken or suspended. Yet what nature cannot do on its own, unless without a lot of damage, say for instance a flood or something like that, you can do something that nature cannot do on its own. Yet you don't violate any laws of nature. The method, the machinery, the placement of all of these things were done by a design. This is what we're saying in regard to the cell, life in the cell. And whatever is being done there had to have been designed, both the method, the machinery of the cell, and as well as where it ends up. Not by random chance. Life, not merely chemical reactions. The same material post-mortem decays. Chemical reactions are channeled outside their expected tendency. Chemical reactions are sequenced in a specific way. For instance, when you have the battery, if you will, of the cell, ATP, and how they are created, and how you have to have all of these steps until the very end one. And it is only as you get to the last step, that you actually have the ability to create the ATP. Well, how do you explain that as mere chance? What would have given you the ability to start off those chains if there was no purpose to those chains? Helper substances, enzymes, RNA, etc. guide the process. In other words, they're like nursemaids to help create whatever it is, whether it be more DNA, or whether it be protein, or whether it be anything else that is needed in the cell. Natural? Natural. Yet could never do it on its own. And unnatural? Natural. Not merely energy. Adding raw energy simply destroys. So you can't say, well, if you have lightning bolts, then you're going to have life. Because the evidence is that it doesn't do it. Life, a jump of fantastic dimensions. In a few minutes, in the presence of such an animated blob, the cell would hardly bolster one's faith in the harmony of nature. The initial impression would certainly be one of utter chaos. And yet there is an order in this strange commotion. It is the invisible and elusive kind of order called life, a phenomenon which in some ways seems increasingly difficult to comprehend as we learn more and more about it. Again, this is Pfeiffer in the cell. Yeah, there is an order, but you just got through saying that evolution is without order, without any kind of intention. How do you get order if you're going to talk about random? There is one step in evolution that far outweighs the others in enormity, the step from macromolecules to cells. All other steps can be accounted for on theoretical grounds, if not correctly, at least elegantly. However, the macromolecule to cell transition is a jump of fantastic dimensions, which lies beyond the range of testable hypothesis. In this area, all is conjecture. The available facts provide no basis for the postulation that cells arose on this planet. There is no scientific evidence. In a soup, why would it be necessary for proteins to hang together until a membrane encloses them? They can't tell you what life is. It just happens in evolution. Sort of like the Big Bang, just happened. But they cannot tell you what is it that makes the difference for a combination of chemicals to build life and not just merely react. Okay, this is a little messed up. The one who is life, only one who is described as having life in himself. For as the Father has life in himself, so he's granted the Son to have life in himself. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Everything receives life from this source. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. For in him we live and move and have our being. This life has a bonus. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. You have something that extends beyond this world. But something very significant. Because Jesus says, not, I have the resurrection. He does not say, I have life. He says, I am the life. And wherever you go, if you have life, you're going to have some kind of connection to me. And if you reject that connection, then you no longer have life. But it's a life that can go on literally forever. BC. A seed is such a miraculous thing it can sit on the shelf forever. But how it knows what to do when it's stuck in the ground is what makes it so clever. It draws nutrients from the soil through its roots and gathers its force from the sun. It puts forth a whole lot of blossoms and fruit that reseeds itself when it's done. Who programmed the seed to know just what to do? And who put the sun in the sky? And who put the food in the dirt for the roots? And who told the bees to come by? And who makes the water to fall from above to refresh and make everything pure? Perhaps all of this is a product of love. That perhaps it happened by chance. Yeah, sure. The theory of evolution. God created this world. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is what makes life worth living. Thank you. The assignment, of course, is as it's there. You have the primitive environment, utterly impossible. And we'll see you next time.